Good morning again, everyone. And again, we welcome you to the December 8th, 2021 edition of the National Newspaper Publishers Association's Let It Be Known. This morning, we have lots of news. First, let's bring on the president and CEO of the National Newspaper Publishers Association, Dr. Benjamin F. Chavis Jr. Dr. Chavis, again, good morning.
Good morning, STACY Brown, on behalf of the National Newspaper Publishers Association. Karen Carter Richard, our distinguished chair of the NNPA, representing 230 African-American-owned newspapers and media companies all over the United States. We're pleased to be a part of this Wednesday morning session of Let It Be Known.
Dr. Chavis, we have a lot of news to get to. Again, we start with the sad news. Cultural critic Greg Tate, whose incisive writing, particularly on topics surrounding Black American culture, influenced a generation. He died yesterday of an undisclosed causes. His death was confirmed by Duke University Press. He was known as the godfather of hip-hop journalism, and he was known as a tremendously talented guitarist and the founder of improv group Burnt Sugar. He was also a co-founder of the Black Rock Coalition, which asserted the Black authorship of rock and roll and which sought equitable treatment of Black artists across all genres. Tate was born in Dayton, Ohio, and after studying journalism and film at Howard University, he moved to New York in the early 1980s and joined the staff of the Village Voice in 1987 and quickly established himself as a challenging, encyclopedic, and brilliantly witty voice on everything from hip-hop to hardcore and free jazz. 5 years later, he published the classic Fly Boy in the Buttermilk. He kept writing for the Village Voice through 2005 and contributed to publications like the New York Times, Rolling Stone, and many other outlets. And he would go on to publish several other noteworthy books, including Midnight Lightning, which Tate called a Jimi Hendrix primer for Black folk, and a Flyboy sequel. Greg Tate has died at the age of 64.
We express our condolences to the Tate family. I knew his parents. I knew Greg for many, many years, and he will be sorely missed. And now for journalists and writers and authors and musicians across the country, we have to keep his legacy alive.
Yeah, absolutely. And Dr. Chavis, in stark contrast to all of the voting suppression laws that have popped up in places around the country, New York City, long a beacon for immigrants, is on the cusp of becoming the largest place in the country to give non-citizens the right to vote in local elections. Legally documented voting age non-citizens comprise nearly 1 in 9 of the city's 7 million voting age residents. Under a bill nearing approval, some 800,000 non-citizens would be allowed to cast ballots in elections to pick the mayor, the city council, and other municipal office holders. Non-citizens still wouldn't be able to vote for president or members of Congress in federal races or in the state elections that pick the governor, judges, and legislators, but they will be able to vote in citywide elections.
Very good. Well, we support voting rights for all people. If you live someplace and you contribute to that community, you ought to have the right to vote.
Well, and Dr. Chavis, also in the news this morning, a Black man's criminal conviction was overturned in Tennessee after an appeals court said the jury, which deliberated in a room adorned with a Confederate flag and a portrait of Jefferson Davis, had been exposed to improper influence. In a 31-page decision issued this week, the state's Criminal Court of Appeals ordered a new trial for Tim Gilbert. The court also ruled that during Gilbert's trial, prosecutors improperly admitted a statement from a key witness. Gilbert was arrested after a family dispute on Christmas Eve 3 years ago in Murfreesboro, southeast of Nashville, according to the decision. A grand jury indicted him the following April on charges of reckless endangerment, unlawful possession of a firearm, and resisting arrest. And he was convicted in a jury trial last year. Both juries deliberated in the UDC room in Giles County Courthouse, which is maintained by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. So the judge said that's just totally unfair, Dr. Chavis.
Well, again, racism and those vestiges of the Confederacy are still very much prominent, not only in Tennessee and other southern states, but across the country. And every time we can get something removed or get a conviction overturned or a rule change because of the presence of these iconic objects that celebrates African slavery, that celebrates white supremacy, those things need to come down.
Yeah, and you know, when you think about it too, like you said, that celebrates African slavery, and you think about jail is just another form of slavery. So you're putting them on trial with the Confederacy all around them. So it sends a message, doesn't it?
Systemic racism institutionalized.
Yeah, absolutely. And Dr. Chavis, this morning, a Black family's successful fight to reclaim a valuable stretch of Southern California shoreline has ignited a national movement with activists eyeing white-owned properties around the country they say rightly belong to African Americans. While we celebrate the Bruce family's victory after decades of fighting, it stands to reason, how about the millions of acres of land lost by Black farmers and Black people in general? Our guest this morning is Lawrence Lucas, President Emeritus of the USDA Coalition of Minority Employees, and journalist James Wright. Good morning, Mr. Lucas and James Wright. How are you guys doing?
Doing great, thank you.
Brother Lucas,
Good
thank
morning.
you. And Brother Wright, thank you for joining us.
Good morning, and I'm pleased to be here.
Well, let's start. Let me go to you first, Mr. Lucas. I know you've done so much work when it comes to discrimination and certainly land loss for Black folks. The Bruce's decision, and along with the fact that just recently we talked to you on the phone about the loss, the 16 million acres that Black farmers have lost in the United States. Your reaction, your thoughts on this, Mr. Lucas?
Well, my reaction is that Black farmers have the legacy of land loss and the legacy of wealth taken from Black farmers is clearly documented in a host of reports. And Dr. Reverend Chavis, he may not remember me, but I take him back to when Leroy Warren was with the NACP, and Dr. Chavis, Reverend Dr. Chavis, I want you to know that I did not forget you, and we worked together back there with many of the civil rights groups, but mainly the NACP at the time was very vocal, and you were a part of that vocal voice to talk about the taking of the land and the discrimination and racism at the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
Yes, I remember.
And I think that, and I'm glad you remember that, because I think of you often, and I think of Leroy Warren often, as we continue this struggle for Black farmers at USDA. There's no question that the land that has been lost by Black farmers, the wealth that has been taken from Black farmers, is historically been documented time and time again in a host of reports, going all the way back to the Civil Rights Act and going back to the Civil Rights Action Team report, going back to the documented 1965 Commission on Civil Rights, the 1982 document on Commission on Civil Rights. So we have a history, and USDA has a history of its racism. What we're trying to do now is convince the administration to systemically deal with the issue of discrimination at USDA. You can settle all the class actions, you can settle all the individual complaints, but if you do not address the systemic problem at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, we're not going to bring about any change in USDA, and it also reflects on what we're trying to do in the country. It so happens I was on the reparations task force in California a month or so ago, and I spoke and I dealt with the Black farmers and the reason why we have lost so much land. So that is,
Mr. Lucas, let me jump in here for a second, Mr. Lucas, and you're obviously we're enjoying the commentary, but let's get to more in depth. So we know that Black farmers have lost 16 million acres of land, have been taken from them, and then we go over to the Bruce family, who for decades, James Wright, they struggled with fighting against eminent domain. Let's take a look, though, first at this video that our producer has put together for this morning's show.
It was a time in America when people were proud of their prejudices. Manhattan Beach claimed it needed the land for a park, paid the Bruces and others a pittance, and while there's a park there now, the land sat vacant for more than 30 years.
When you're robbed of your dignity, when you're robbed of your integrity, when you're robbed of your decent basic rights as a human being and mistreated like that, I mean, it sticks with you for a long time.
It was a
Yeah. So, James, you know, the gentleman said it sticks with you for a long time. You've talked and reported on eminent domain practices, and we see that the racial home ownership gap is at its highest level in more than 50 years. 79.1% of white Americans own a home compared to 41.8% of Black Americans. James, talk about eminent domain.
Well, first of all, let's be clear. Eminent domain is a proper legal tool, which is codified by the U.S. Constitution and various governmental bodies. It is a proper tool. The problem is that it has often been a tool that has been used against African Americans. You talk about the Bruce family. They were given a pittance. They were supposed to get proper compensation for that land. I suggest that if they had gotten proper compensation for that land in the 1920s, they would not have had to go to court. Let me take you 30 years later from that, when President Eisenhower built the interstate highway system. What is not written about a lot is that many communities, Black communities, were devastated, which is something I personally know, when these systems were built. And when the property was taken by eminent domain, these Black communities were basically shortchanged or given pittances, as the man said in the video, for their land. And then, and Stacy and Dr. Chavis, you're in the nation's capital. In the 1960s, there was a program called Urban Renewal, in which Southwest Washington, Black people were basically pushed out of Southwest Washington. They received a pittance. That was eminent domain. It was not, they were not properly compensated. And even, and you mentioned the NAACP, Hillary Shelton testified a few years ago before the U.S. Civil Rights Commission about eminent domain and how it has been extremely harmful to Black people. So I commend the Bruce family for standing up and having the girth to fight this thing as long as they have. But the truth is, eminent domain has been a tool used against Black people in keeping their land. And we as Black people need to stand up and fight, not eminent domain, but the way it has been used.
Yeah, and Dr. Chavis, when we talk about just 41% of Black Americans own a home, but the gap is even larger when you consider the racist housing practices such as redlining, which denied Black residents mortgages to buy or loans to renovate property legally, right? And you think about this too. One report, Dr. Chavis, in 2017 out of Massachusetts showed that Blacks in Boston, in the Boston region, it says their net worth was $8, whites $247,500, and they attributed that to lack of land and home ownership.
Yes, I want to just go back and tie this together with what Brother Lucas said and what Brother Wright has reported. And thank you for giving those statistics, Stacy. Look, after the Civil War, the majority of African Americans were in the South. We all know there have been books that have been about the migration to Michigan and to Chicago and to up north. And many went to Boston to escape the hardship of the South in New York and other places. But we were farmers. We owned millions of land. I mean, acres of land. And when the 40 acres and the mule was signed by General Sherman after the Civil War in Savannah, Georgia, they had plotted out all this coastal property. So that the significance of what just happened with the Bruce family in California is very significant to what Brother Lucas said about the USDA. In addition to eminent domain, in addition to county clerks in most counties in the South robbing people of their land, particularly when somebody passed away, The USDA was an instrument. I'm talking about the United States Department of Agriculture was an instrument of helping take Black farmers' land. Most of the land that Black people used to own historically was farmland. Why don't we own it today? And that's why we need to make sure now that the Biden-Harris administration hopefully will correct the systemic racism in the U.S. Department of Agriculture, as well as now following the lead for what happened. I think it's a great precedent, Stacey, what happened in California that can be used legally now, even as we approach the federal government. So we're talking about municipal policy, state policy, federal policy, and we're talking about that in all these multiple areas. And what Brother Wright said about what happened in D.C., it's all systemic. There were multiple. Here's the thing. A lot of times when we talk about Black oppression, we talk about it from one angle. But what we have to understand is that we had 360 degrees of different angles of Black oppression. And the taking of our land was the result of it. And it still has not been corrected. We have all the statistics, but it has not been a correction in terms of reparations for Black farmers, Black landowners, and Black America.
Well, and Dr. Chavis, that does you summed it up nicely, and so it leads to the question, Mr. Lucas, James, would the Bruce Beach case be a one-off or a tipping point in the national struggle over Black land ownership? Your thoughts? You've been working so hard on this for years, Mr. Lucas. Is it a tipping point?
I think it is a tipping point, but I think we have to address what the problems are at USDA. As Reverend Chavis has indicated, you have the U.S. Department of Agriculture that has been taking the land of Black farmers for years. And what you have is what they call a county committee system was put in after the Roosevelt years. And then this county committee system was the tool by which farmers had to go to these county committees in rural America in order to get the same programs and services that white farmers get. And then on top of that, you had the Office of General Counsel there at the U.S. Department of Agriculture that also worked diligently at denying the processing of complaints as they came in. So you had when a farmer complains about what is going on and denying the same programs that white farmers get and programs that white farmers get, USDA failed to even process their complaint. And I think that the history is very clear and the documentation on this is very clear. And we want this administration to get a handle on the systemic problem and not spend time coming up with equity commissions that's only going to research and find out what we already know.
Yeah, I'm going to give a quote from Kayvon Ward, who helped lead the successful fight on behalf of the Bruce family and who has co-founded a group called Where Is My Land, which is aimed at advocating for other Black people who are trying to reclaim lost and stolen land. Kayvon says that the reason it's getting so much attention now is there's been a precedent set, and that's what's given hope to other families. So James, Kayvon believes that it's given hope to other families. Is there hope? Do you feel hope?
Well, David Youngblood in the chat talked about saying it's a one-off. I would, all due respect to David, I hope he's wrong. I hope that this does become a precedent. I hope that this becomes a case in which Black people stand up for their land. And, you have to give praise to the Bruce family for doing this since the 1920s. And let me just say this. People have to understand these eminent domain cases are just not the be all end all. If you are subject to eminent domain, you can fight it. Now, if you look at white people will go out here and fight for their land. They will hire lawyers they really can't afford in order to keep their land. We have to be just as vigilant in terms of keeping our land. And if we have to use legal means, taking it to court, we have to do that. We can no longer, Stacey, just sit back and just say, okay, it's the government. They can take my land. They got the right to. No. fight them on this thing. Fight them on this thing. And these things can be reversed, but we have to take them on to fight for our land.
Yeah, and Dr. Chavis and Mr. Lucas, James mentions a reference, David Youngblood. I'm looking at some other things that David noted. He says eminent domain, redlining, local probate judges, and all have contributed to Black land loss. He also mentions that heirship laws allow one beneficiary to sell the entire parcel without the consent of the other beneficiary. So you have a firestorm here, a whole thing here that really stands in the way.
Oh, absolutely. And again, I think it all ties together. Well, listen, all this is about systemic oppression, and there needs to be a systemic resolution, a systemic solution to this kind of oppression, this kind of discrimination, this kind of actually robbery of our land, and it needs to be restored. And now that HR 40, I agree, we need to do more than studied reparations. We need to have activations where our families will begin to be restored with the land that's rightly owned. So I see what happened in California as a tipping point, and I think it needs to be followed on aggressively by Black farmers, by Black landowners, and by others who have been victimized so systematically.
Yeah, and Mr. Lucas, again, we know that you're at the forefront of this fight. How are things in Congress? Have you spoken to anybody in Congress? What's the feeling in Congress about Black land ownership? I know your focus has been Black farmers, but have you had recent conversations? I know you wrote a letter to the agricultural secretary, a really strong letter at that.
Well, what we've attempted to do is take on this issue head on and not spend a lot of time coming up with things that don't work. We've recommended the U.S. Department of Agriculture. If you take a look at all the reports and all the research that's been done, out of all those many reports and the abundance of those reports, they have recommendations and solutions. The problem is that the U.S. Department of Agriculture, after coming up with these recommendations and solutions, they do nothing about the fixes. You have a OIG report in September that came out that showed that it took 799 days to process a complaint that should have been processed in 180 days. These are the kind of things that we know that needs to be fixed at USDA. And what we're fighting, the Justice for Black Farmer Group and the USDA Coalition of Minority Employees are fighting for, is to make sure that this administration do due diligence and not allow the Secretary Tom Vilsack to continue to come up with false solutions, but take a deep dive into what is really needed to fix the systemic problem at USDA, and not all these other platitudes that the government comes up with, but it doesn't fix the problem.
Yeah, and just Bobby Henry's asking about the name of that organization we mentioned just a short time ago. It's called Where Is My Land? You can look them up. You can Google them. They have a website. Where's My Land? Dr. Chavis, your closing thoughts.
Well, this is another discussion. It looks like each morning, Stacey, we have to continue these discussions, and we appreciate the Black press. And I just want to let Brother Lucas know, and of course Brother Wright knows it, that the Black press of America, we're going to continue to raise this issue. We salute your longevity in fighting to get Black farmers their land back, and you can depend on the Black press to be with you. And we salute the Bruce family for their victory, because it's not only a victory for that one family, it's a victory for Black America.
Yeah, absolutely. Mr. Lucas, James Wright, again, we thank you so much for joining us this morning. This discussion will definitely continue. As Dr. Chavis said, we are having so many discussions that we have to continue. Our audience, our readers, they all demand that we continue these discussions. Also, the National Newspaper Publishers Association's Midwinter Training Conference kicks off on January 19th. We'll be at the Diplomat Beach Resort in Hollywood, Florida, through January the 22nd, where the theme is the publishing industry advancing the Black press of America, reaffirming, engaging, and empowering. Visit www.nnpa/events.com, nnpa-events.com to register and reserve your hotel rooms now at that beautiful resort. In order to get the NNPA's discounted rate, hotel rooms must be reserved by December 12th. Obviously, time is flying by. We only have 4 days left for that special discounted rate. Many of our publishers will be there, editors, journalists, and everybody you want to meet will be there just to discuss the Black press, what we're doing today, what we're going to be doing tomorrow, and going forward to serve the Black community as we have for nearly 195 years. Thank you for joining us, everybody. Stay safe and stay well. We'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you.